At 1:47 in the morning, a doorbell camera in a quiet Tucson neighborhood goes dark. 25 minutes later, motion is detected at the same front door. No footage is saved. The camera has no active subscription. At 2:28 a.m., a medical device hundreds of miles away from any hospital, an 84-year-old woman's pacemaker monitor, silently disconnects from her phone. She will not be seen again. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. She's a grandmother, a churchgoer, a widow who built a quiet life in the Arizona desert. And she is also the mother of one of the most recognizable faces in American television. Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, watched by millions of Americans every single morning. 4 months, Savannah did something almost no one in her position has ever had to do. She stepped off the biggest stage in television news to search for her own mother. This is the story of a disappearance that has baffled the FBI, divided investigators, and left a family clinging to a single, devastating possibility that the answer they're searching for might already be the worst one imaginable. This is the case of Nancy Guthrie. To understand this case, you have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was before any of this happened. Nancy Ellen Guthrie, born Nancy Ellen Long, came into the world on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. In the early 1970s, she made the move that would define the rest of her life. She relocated with her family to Tucson, Arizona, settling in a community called Catalina Foothills, a quiet suburb framed by mountains on the edge of the Sonoran Desert. She would call that area home for more than 5 decades. By 2026, Nancy was 84 years old. Those close to the family have described her as sharp as a tack, in the words used publicly by her daughter. But her body was not as resilient as her mind. She lived with a heart condition serious enough to require a pacemaker, and she depended on daily medication just to manage her health and her pain. Friends say she couldn't walk very far without assistance. She was, by every account, deeply embedded in her community. A regular at a virtual church service with friends, the kind of steady, familiar presence neighbors wave to without thinking twice. And then there's the part of her life that put a national spotlight on this case the moment it happened. Nancy is the mother of Savannah Guthrie. If you've turned on a television in the morning any time in the last decade, you've probably seen Savannah Guthrie. She's been a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most watched morning news programs in the country. Nancy also has 2 other children, Annie Guthrie and Cameron Guthrie, both of whom would become central, vocal figures in the search for their mother. On the night of January 31, 2026, by all accounts, Nancy Guthrie was doing something completely ordinary. She had dinner with her daughter Annie and her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, at Annie's home in Tucson. Sometime around 9:45 p.m., she was dropped off back at her own house. It was a normal night. Nothing about it suggested anything was wrong. It would be the last time, as far as we know, that anyone saw Nancy Guthrie. What happened next has been pieced together almost entirely from digital forensics, timestamps, device logs, software detection events. Because there were no witnesses. There was number 911 call from inside that house. There was only data. Here is the timeline, as investigators have laid it out. 1:47 a.m., Nancy's video doorbell camera disconnects. Around 2:12 a.m., the camera's software detects movement at the door. But here's the critical detail: there is no footage. Nancy didn't have an active cloud subscription for the device, so instead of saving the clip, the system simply looped over and erased it. The sheriff would later describe this as the camera rewriting itself. 2:28 a.m., 16 minutes after that motion was detected, Nancy's pacemaker app disconnects from her phone. Think about what that sequence implies. A camera goes dark. Someone is detected at the door. And minutes later, a device that monitors an 84-year-old woman's heart goes silent. Nothing happens for the next 9 hours. 11:56 a.m., Nancy doesn't show up for her scheduled virtual church service. Her friends, unable to reach her, alert her family. 12:03 p.m., a 911 call is placed. 12:15 p.m., deputies with the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrive at the home. What they found inside did not look like an elderly woman who'd simply wandered off, or fallen, or suffered a medical event alone. Officials would later describe the conditions inside the home as very concerning, language deliberately chosen to convey that this did not look like a voluntary disappearance. Personal items had been left behind. A doorbell security camera had been removed, and investigators recovered bloodstains at the scene that would later be forensically confirmed to be Nancy's own blood. By 6:46 p.m. that evening, the Pima County Sheriff's Department made it official, announcing Nancy Guthrie's disappearance to the public. The day after that, on February 2nd, authorities went a step further. This was not, they said, a missing person who had wandered off. Nancy Guthrie had been kidnapped, abducted, or otherwise taken against her will. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos would become one of the central voices of this investigation in the months that followed. A steady, sometimes blunt presence in front of the cameras, fielding a flood of public pressure that very few missing person cases ever generate. Because almost immediately, this stopped being a regional Arizona story. Within 24 hours, the kidnapping of Nancy Guthrie was a national story, not just because of what happened, but because of who she was related to. Savannah Guthrie was scheduled to co-host NBC's coverage of the opening ceremonies of the 2026 Winter Olympics. Instead, she stepped away entirely, pulling out of one of the biggest broadcasting assignments of her career to fly to Tucson and join the search for her mother. Even her own workplace responded. The Today Show set itself was decorated with yellow flowers, a quiet visual echo of flowers left outside Nancy's actual home in Tucson, where the community had begun leaving tributes and search information. On the ground, the investigation rapidly scaled into a massive, multi-agency operation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department led the case, but they weren't alone. The FBI joined almost immediately, along with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, given Tucson's proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border, and search and rescue teams combing the surrounding desert. Investigators began doing what they do in any case like this: forensic analysis of the home, neighborhood canvassing, and a request for any private surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses that might show something, anything, from the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance. One law enforcement source would later describe the sheer scale of that effort, reviewing thousands of hours of footage, frame by frame, looking for anything out of place. The case even reached the White House. Following an NBC interview, President Trump personally called Savannah Guthrie on February 4th, offering additional federal resources and, according to reports, expressing hope for her mother's safe return. 2 weeks later, the president would publicly threaten capital punishment for whoever was responsible, a striking, unusual level of presidential involvement in a regional missing person case. But the most powerful moment of those early days didn't come from a press conference or a presidential statement. It came from Savannah herself. On February 4th, Savannah Guthrie posted a video statement on Instagram, directly addressing whoever might be holding her mother. She described her mother's fragile health, the pain Nancy lived with, her dependence on medication just to survive day to day. And she made a direct appeal that the family needed proof that her mother was alive. Because, as she put it, in a world where images and voices can so easily be faked, they needed certainty, not assumptions.
Hi there. I'm coming on to say it is day 24 since our mom was taken in the dark of night from her bed. And every hour and minute and second and every long night has been agony since then, of worrying about her and fearing for her and aching for her, and most of all, just missing her, We know that millions of you have been praying. So many people have been praying, of every faith and no faith at all, praying for her return. And we feel those prayers. Please keep praying without ceasing. We still believe. We still believe in a miracle. We still believe that she can come home. Hope against hope. As my sister says, we are blowing on the embers of hope. We also know that she may be lost. She may already be gone. She may have already gone home to the Lord that she loves and is dancing in heaven with her mom and her dad and with her beloved brother Pierce and with our daddy. And if this is what is to be, then we will accept it. But we need to know where she is. We need her to come home. For that reason, we are offering a family reward of up to $1 million for any information that leads us to her recovery. All of the information about this reward and the details is in the caption below. You can call the 1-800-TIP line. You can be anonymous if you want. Someone out there knows something that can bring her home. Somebody knows. And we are begging you to please come forward now. We also know that we are not alone in our loss. We know there are millions of families that have suffered with this kind of uncertainty. And for that reason today, we also are donating $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for their work in helping families who are coping with loss and actively looking for those who are lost. We are hoping that the attention that has been given to our mom and our family will extend to all the families like ours who are in need and need prayers and need support. So please, if you hear this message, if you've been waiting and you haven't been sure, let this be your sign to please come forward, tell what you know, and help us bring our beloved mom home so that we can either celebrate a glorious, miraculous homecoming or celebrate the beautiful, brave, and courageous and noble life that she has lived. Please be the light in the dark. Thank you.
It was the beginning of a pattern that would define this case for months. A family forced to communicate in public with someone who refused to identify themselves. Just one day after Nancy went missing, the case took its strangest turn yet. On February 2nd, two local Tucson news stations and the outlet TMZ all received the same thing through their online tip lines, a message claiming to be from whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie. This is, on its face, deeply unusual. In virtually every real kidnapping for ransom case, communication goes directly and privately to the family, not blasted out to multiple news organizations. Former FBI agents who reviewed the case would later call this highly unusual, and at CrimeCon Las Vegas months later, veteran investigators would say flatly that going to TMZ is the last place you go if your actual goal is collecting a ransom. But at the time, the family had no choice but to take it seriously. The note demanded payment, reportedly millions of dollars in Bitcoin, with a deadline. By February 8th, reporting indicated the specific number, $6 million, with a deadline of 5 p.m. the following day, February 9th. On February 7th, the day before that deadline, Savannah Guthrie, alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron, released another video. This time, the message was unmistakable.
We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay.
It is hard to overstate how raw that moment was. A family broadcasting directly to an anonymous captor, agreeing to pay whatever was being asked, in the hope that it would bring their mother home. The deadline came. February 9th, 5 p.m. And then it passed. No further contact. No proof of life. Nothing. On February 24th, more than 3 weeks in, the Guthrie family made a separate, more traditional appeal, a reward of $1 million for any information that could help bring Nancy home. Combined with a federal reward that would eventually reach $100,000, the total incentive for information climbed past $1 million. It is one of the largest privately funded rewards in a missing person case in recent memory. And still, nothing concrete emerged. On February 10th, 9 days after Nancy disappeared, the case got its first real break. FBI Director Kash Patel personally announced that investigators had recovered something nobody expected to get back: footage from that disconnected doorbell camera. Remember, this camera had no active cloud subscription. When motion was detected, the standard footage wasn't saved. It simply looped and erased itself. But forensic teams were able to dig into what's called residual back-end data, essentially recovering fragments the device had stored before they were overwritten. What they recovered was chilling. 4 black and white images, released directly by Director Patel, showing a masked, armed figure, wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, at Nancy Guthrie's front door. The footage showed the individual attempting to physically tamper with the doorbell camera. First, light taps, apparently trying to knock the device loose. When that failed, the person used foliage from a nearby potted plant to physically cover the lens. Patel also revealed a strange, specific detail. The individual appeared to be armed with what looked like a handgun, but it was holstered unusually, positioned at the front of the body rather than on the hip or thigh as most holsters are worn. 2 videos were released the same day. And 2 days later, on February 12th, the FBI sharpened the suspect description even further based on continued analysis. A man, average build, an estimated 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall. One detail that the FBI specifically asked the public to focus on: the backpack. Investigators identified it as a black, 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker pack, a specific, identifiable retail product, the kind of detail that can sometimes crack a case if the right person recognizes it. But here's where the case gets genuinely strange. Investigators determined that not all of the recovered images were from the same day. One image, showing the suspect at the door without the backpack, appears to have been captured on a different day, before February 1st entirely. The footage clearly tied to the morning of the abduction, the one with the backpack, was from February 1st itself, the day Nancy failed to show up for her virtual church service. One theory investigators have floated, that the suspect may have approached the house once before, spotted the camera, and retreated, only to come back later, this time prepared to disable it. The sheriff's department was careful to note something important here, too. There's no reliable date or timestamp metadata tied to these recovered images. Everything about the timeline has had to be reconstructed indirectly, through device logs and software behavior, not through clean, verified footage. With a suspect description in hand, investigators turned to physical evidence, and for months, almost every lead seemed to dissolve the moment it was tested. The same day the doorbell footage was released, the sheriff's department detained a man for questioning during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, about 60 miles south of Tucson. Sources said the FBI had identified him using a series of electronic investigative tools: phone usage, traffic data. His home was searched. He was questioned for hours. He was released without charges. The man, Carlos Palazuelos, later identified himself publicly. He was not involved. Then came the gloves. In February, investigators recovered a pair of black gloves found roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home, gloves that, visually, appeared to resemble the type worn by the masked figure in the doorbell footage. For a moment, it looked like a potential breakthrough. Investigators ran the DNA from those gloves against Cody's, the combined DNA index system, the FBI's national database holding more than 19 million offender profiles. No match. The DNA also didn't match anything recovered from Nancy's home. Weeks later, those gloves were ultimately traced, not to a kidnapper, but to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the case whatsoever. It's worth pausing on this, because it illustrates just how exhausting this investigation has been. Investigators reportedly collected 16 separate gloves from the area around the house during their search. Most were quickly ruled out as unrelated debris. In one particularly grim moment, captured on video and widely circulated, investigators were seen examining the septic tank near Nancy's property, using a long stick and a flashlight to check inside. It was a stark, visceral image. A search that had moved from canvassing neighborhoods to literally searching beneath the ground of her own home. Nothing was found there. Investigators even deployed a piece of equipment described as a signal sniffer via helicopter, technology aimed at detecting any residual signal from Nancy's pacemaker, in the hope that the device itself might still be transmitting something, somewhere. Detectives also visited gun shops across the Tucson area, working off the detail from the doorbell footage that the suspect had been carrying a holster the sheriff described as having distinctive characteristics, though no breakthrough from that line of inquiry has been publicly reported. Through all of this, one detail repeated by Sheriff Nanos became something close to a refrain for this case. Nothing recovered, no DNA, no evidence collected anywhere in this investigation has returned a match in Cody's. Whoever did this had no prior criminal DNA footprint on file, or had simply never been caught before. As recently as mid-June, the case took another strange detour. A 40-year-old woman named Coral Michelle Smith was named in a wanted alert by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, accused of an unrelated kidnapping and aggravated assault that took place just 7 miles from Nancy's home, in late May. She was arrested June 15. Investigators have publicly stated there is no established connection between Smith and the Guthrie case. Smith doesn't match the physical description of the masked suspect. Among other things, the suspect's wrist had a visible tattoo. Smith's tattoos are reportedly located elsewhere on her body. But in a case this saturated with dead ends, even an unrelated arrest 7 miles away becomes national news. For months, this case existed in a kind of agonizing limbo. No body. No confirmed sighting, no proof of life, and no real answers. Then, in late June 2026, more than 4 months after Nancy vanished, the case took its darkest turn yet. It emerged that a second note had been sent on February 6, 2026, just 5 days after the abduction, and just 1 day before Savannah's emotional plea to pay for her mother's return. This note was different from the first. It made no ransom demand. It asked for nothing. According to multiple sources who reviewed its contents, the note stated that Nancy Guthrie had died, and that her death had happened shortly after the abduction itself. The note reportedly did not apologize for taking her. But according to people familiar with its contents, it did express what was described as regret over her death, language suggesting, chillingly, that whoever wrote it claimed they did not mean for her to die. For nearly 5 months, law enforcement chose not to make this note public. The reasoning, according to investigators, was strategic. They wanted to preserve the ability to authenticate any future communication from the same source, without tipping off the public, or the sender, to exactly what they knew. It wasn't until June 22, 2026, that the existence and contents of this note became public, first reported by NBC News. Investigators have said they believe both notes, the ransom demand and the one claiming Nancy had died, were likely sent by the same person or group, based on matching language, style, and even the same computer IP address. It's a detail that recontextualizes everything that came before it. When Savannah Guthrie stood with her siblings on February 7th and said, "We will pay," by the timeline now being reported, that emotional, public plea may have come after the people holding her mother had already, secretly, told the media that Nancy was dead. It's critical to be precise here. This is the content of an unverified note from an unidentified source. It is not a forensic confirmation of Nancy Guthrie's death. No remains have been recovered. No medical examiner has made any determination. Investigators have called the note's contents potentially legitimate, meaning they believe it likely came from the actual abductor, but that is a statement about the note's authenticity as a piece of communication, not a confirmed fact about what happened to Nancy. As of late June 2026, Nancy Guthrie's case remains officially classified as an open investigation into her disappearance, not a confirmed homicide. With official answers in short supply, a chorus of independent investigators, retired agents, and forensic experts have spent months publicly dissecting every detail of this case. At CrimeCon Las Vegas, a panel that included longtime medical legal death investigator Barbara Butcher, known for hosting Oxygen's The Death Investigator, offered one of the more detailed public theories floated in this case. Butcher's theory centers on motive and on a basic, grim irony that whoever targeted Nancy Guthrie likely did so because of her famous daughter, assuming, incorrectly, that the family's visibility meant immediate, accessible wealth. She raised the possibility that the perpetrator may have had some indirect connection to the home, speculating, for example, about a service worker or handyman who might have learned, secondhand, that this was Savannah Guthrie's mother's house. And if Nancy died shortly after the abduction, as the second note claims, Butcher suggested the most likely chain of events: a panicked perpetrator suddenly holding a body instead of a ransom opportunity, with no plan for what to do next, leading, in her assessment, to Nancy's remains potentially being buried somewhere in the surrounding desert. That theory lines up, in part, with something that happened on the ground months earlier. In June, the volunteer search group Buscando Corazones Nogales, a Mexican organization dedicated to searching for missing persons, received a tip claiming Nancy was buried near Nogales, close to the U.S. Mexico border. They conducted a search. No remains were found. Other voices at that same CrimeCon panel raised pointed criticism, not of the suspect, but of the investigation itself. Attorney Donna Rotuno and Fox Nation's Paul Morrow both criticized how the crime scene was initially handled, suggesting failures to properly secure it and gather time-sensitive evidence. One journalist on the panel, Michael Ruiz, recounted being able to walk right up to Nancy's front door during his reporting, telling the panel a deputy had actually told him to do so. Morrow argued plainly that these early missteps could make any future prosecution significantly harder, regardless of who's eventually identified as a suspect. There's also been quiet friction reported between agencies over evidence handling decisions, including disagreement over whether a recovered hair sample, a potential key piece of DNA evidence, should be processed at a lab in Florida or at the FBI's own facility in Quantico, Virginia. The choice of lab might sound like a bureaucratic detail, but in cases like this, chain of custody and turnaround time can matter enormously. And nearly every investigator who has weighed in publicly agrees on one thing: the way the notes were delivered doesn't match a typical, profit-motivated kidnapping. Sending a ransom demand to TMZ and local news stations, rather than directly and privately to the family, reads, in the words of one investigator on the CrimeCon panel, like someone looking for attention rather than looking to gain a ransom in a legitimate kidnapping. The notes also lacked something nearly universal in real ransom cases: any proof of life and any real urgency. As of this video, it has been more than 4 months since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her own home. Savannah Guthrie has returned to the Today Show. In an emotional conversation with her former co-host Hoda Kotb, she said she would not hide that stepping back onto that set was its own kind of impossible decision. "I can't come back and try to be something that I'm not," she said, "but I can't not come back because it's my family. I think it's part of my purpose right now." Behind the scenes, though, the show has reportedly built in a kind of emotional firewall, strict procedures for how any breaking news about the case is handled if it happens live. Savannah is reportedly sequestered from the news desk in those moments, with another anchor stepping in to cover the story, so she isn't forced to learn new developments about her own mother on live television. Sheriff Chris Nanos has continued to give regular updates, candid, if not always hopeful, ones. In one recent interview, he acknowledged the pace of the investigation directly. "It moves at a snail's pace, I guess for some," he said, while insisting that meaningful work continues behind the scenes. Investigators say they have received thousands of tips since February. By their own estimate, only around 10% carry any real investigative value, but every one of them still has to be checked. The reward for information remains active and substantial, more than $1.2 million combined between the family's contribution and federal funds. The FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, remains open. Tucson's Crime Stoppers affiliate, 88 Crime, continues to take anonymous local tips as well. As recently as June 25, 2026, officials confirmed publicly Nancy Guthrie has not been located. The investigation remains open. Forensic and digital evidence analysis, according to a statement marking the 100-day point in the case, is still ongoing. No arrests, no charges, no confirmed answer about what actually happened inside that house in the early hours of February 1st. Just a family, still waiting somewhere between a disconnected doorbell camera and a note no one was meant to see for 5 months. The truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie is still sitting, unresolved, in an open case file in Pima County, Arizona. Maybe it's in a desert outside Nogales. Maybe it's in a piece of digital evidence no one's connected yet. Or maybe, and investigators haven't ruled this out, it's still ahead of us, in a tip that hasn't come in yet. If you have any information related to this case, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI, or you can submit a tip directly at tips.fbi.gov. If you want to be here when this case gets its next major update, and given how this one has gone, it probably will, make sure you're subscribed, because we'll be covering it the moment something breaks. Thank you for watching.